Hello and welcome to the Zach Thinks Your podcast. Today I'm joined by Rose Hackman. I almost just did it wrong. Rose.Hackwoman on Instagram. If you guys are watching the video, right behind me is her book, Emotional Labor, which made a huge difference in how I see and understand the experience of women in today's world. I am creating a new program with the curriculum is based around her book, coming up in the next month. And I wanted to have her on, one for the guys that are going to be in that program, to hear straight from her, as well as I think she's doing really amazing work. And as much as there are a lot of hard lessons, I think, in that book for a tall, white, straight man to swallow, where it was really valuable for me. So Rose, thank you for joining me today and talking.
Thank you so much for having me, Zach. It's great to be here.
One of the things that I think I really loved about Emotional Labor in the book was that you did a really great job interviewing and coming up with some diverse examples, as well as you got into some really uncomfortable history behind some of what has caused these things. I don't even know where to start here. What would you say is one of the maybe more exciting things that you uncovered as you were doing your research for the book and writing it? Maybe exciting is not the right word.
I find this topic really exciting.
Okay, good.
So that sounds great. Do you want me to give a quick definition of what emotional labor is? I know that most people...
That would probably be a great place to start.
Okay. So, I think a lot of people think emotional labor and the mental load are the same. And while there is a lot of overlap, they're actually quite different. Emotional labor is the editing work of emotions a person will do on themselves in order to have an effect on the emotions of other people. You can think of it as a smile that you might give to a group regardless of whether you're feeling good inside, in order to make them feel good inside. Anyone at all can do emotional labor. Oh my gosh, I've got an electrician at the door. Okay, let me...
I'll do my version of the definition. You can come back in a minute.
Okay, sorry.
You're good. So I think when I talk about emotional labor, I think I'm similarly talking about the modulation of our feelings. I think whenever I think about emotional labor, I'm considering the feelings that are going on. So I think she used different words than I typically use. So I use modulation, but really just the adjustment. So the example I often give is let's say you're working a 9 to 5 and you have a manager, and let's say there's a woman in there and her boss is a man, and he constantly needs maybe his ego stroked or something sort of before it starts, or he needs to have some small talk about something that feels inappropriate for a lot of women to talk about. The adjustment and management of her tone in that boardroom such that he feels comfortable, rather than her setting a firm boundary of hey, let's not talk about that in this boardroom, where even though you're my manager, I have a boundary and you're passing it. The management of emotions to not communicate that and let that person be on their own, I think, is a good example of emotional labor. Another example, and maybe you can critique this here, Rose, is the book that I'm working on writing, which currently is titled Mental Load Explained by a Recovering Man-Child. I don't know if that'll actually be the title, but I said that picking up socks off the ground is labor. Thinking about picking up socks is labor. Thinking about the experience of a potential guest in your home seeing socks on the ground is labor. And so that third one, I think, is what I would say is also emotional labor. So you're talking about the adjustment of how you deliver a message and your tone and your physical or your facial expression. Is there another word to describe the consideration of other people's feelings, when they're not present there?
Because I just let the electrician in, I'm thoroughly discombobulated. You want another word basically, you want me to you tell me what you want me to do.
So the definition that you just gave was talking about the editing of feelings, right? So
Yeah.
it's the adjustment of how you talk about something. I think oftentimes when I talk about emotional labor, there's another piece to it, which is the consideration of someone
Right.
else's experience.
Which, if you think of it, when you're smiling for the benefit, for the well-being of the people around you, effectively, you're thinking about the experiences of other people. You're putting other people's feelings above and beyond
Mm.
your own. There's a kind of emotional labor can be extremely literal. So it can be, literally, I feel sad, but I'm going to pretend I'm happy so that my kids are not worried about their parents being sad, for example. That is very explicit emotional labor. But then the act of thinking, of tapping into the emotions of other people, of thinking of the well-being and experiences of other people, it can kind of go a little higher in terms of how you then decide to not just emote but act. So just as you were saying, not bothering to pick up your socks, for example, or actually picking up your socks, that is, if we're going to be very literal, the act of picking up socks is an act of physical labor because it's a physical act. But the thoughtfulness of maybe your partner coming in from a long day at work and thinking, my partner's not going to like seeing socks everywhere, and I want my partner to be in a kind of a positive, peaceful, happy state of mind when they come home. Let me pick up after myself. That is not just physical labor, it's emotional labor, because you're doing it because you're actually doing it as a part of an act of care for, in this case, your domestic partner. I did want to say, because a lot of the pushback, the initial pushback that I get when I talk to people about this is, can't everyone do emotional labor? And the answer is yes, and that's why I was about to go in when I was giving the definition. And in fact, because you're someone who talks a lot about both the mental load and emotional labor, I think it's really important to point out that it's everywhere in the home, but it's not at all just in the home. And I think I went away to the front of the apartment, so I didn't hear how you were defining it, but I love the fact it sounds like you were talking about it within the context of work. At work, all of us, regardless of gender, unless we're the absolute boss, are going to have to do quite a lot of emotional labor with colleagues, with clients, customers, certainly with bosses. There is going to be a suppression of your authentic self that you're going to have to do in order to, placate a boss, cater to the, potentially unhinged emotions of a customer. So it's really something that interacts with all aspects of everyday life. But the way in which it's been built in our society is the expectation is that it's women and minorities that should shoulder this invisible form of work at all times, because in essence, emotional labor is an expression of power or lack thereof. So much of the way in which we are so often playing out emotional labor dynamics is the person who doesn't feel like they have to do emotional labor is effectively taking a kind of a position of power, and the person who is doing emotional labor for that person, catering to them, is effectively centering them and centering their experience and decentering themselves. And I think and I will stop there. I think that was my first eureka moment in these years of research that it took me to write this book. The first amazing aha moment was emotional labor is not inherently about gender at all. It's about power. And incredible amounts of neuroscientific research and psychology research show us that all humans, regardless of gender, are able to be really good at emotional labor. It's just a question of practicing and putting the effort in.
There's as you were talking, there are 5 or 6 different things I want to bring up there. I'm going to go with this one because when I think of the word empathy, is a skill, and I think a lot of people have talked about people not having the skill. And what you're just saying there, pretty much empathy is a skill; it can be learned. And I think Laura Danger had grabbed one of my posts and talked about that. And when I was, I didn't have language for this when my wife was pregnant, but I wore a weighted vest and a fanny pack with a 10-pound weight in it so that I could, method act a little bit of the experience of pregnancy. I would notice beforehand, like there were moments throughout the day I was going to work and I was like, oh, that's right, my wife's pregnant. Like there would be these moments of like, my life is in transition about to become a dad. But when I had the weighted vest on and things, and I'm a tall guy, I usually skip 3 stairs when I am going up a large flight of stairs. I'd get whacked in the crotch. And I was like, oh, that's right. Alyssa can't do that right now. She can't do as athletic things because of her body. And so there were a lot of those moments when I was trying to kind of check my privilege in having those bodily things. Even in the summer, I knew that her temperature regulation sucks in general, but it sucked more when she was pregnant. And so I put on a sweater or a sweatshirt over the weighted vest, and I committed to myself, I'm not taking this off so that I can experience some of the kind of crappy experience that she has. And so I guess I would ask is what's like the overlap in definition so I can be kind of using it appropriately around like I felt like what I did was I was developing my empathy for her, and what I might try to use the word emotional labor to just say that same thing is I was doing the emotional labor of considering her experience so that I could build the skill of empathy. Am I kind of saying that right, do you think?
I mean, the way I would say it is emotional labor is empathy in action.
Hmm.
And I think, and the more you do empathy, the more you do emotional labor, the better at it you get. I think we think of a lot of these traits as fixed and innate. And exactly as you're describing, they're actually a practice and a skill that you develop over time. It just so happens that. Thank you. It just so happens that girls from a really, really young age are taught to share their toys and be very other oriented and not be too assertive and not be, too competitive. I mean, obviously, depending on the family, these are gross generalizations, but
Don't set too hard of boundaries, right?
right,
Which
right, right, and
very
like
much translates later in life when they're,
right,
oh yeah, I'll take your drink. I don't
sure,
fucking want your drink, but I'll
sure,
take it.
pleasing others and being agreeable to others as a priority, and obviously boys are taught to win and be competitive and suppress their emotions. At the same time, they don't, they're what we might see for girls as the selfishness, we would probably see like as future leadership skills when it comes to a boy. So all of these kind of small double standards that are not just happening at home, they're happening really everywhere, play into this dynamic that develops, where by the time you've got adults, a lot of women have had years of practice trying to figure out what other people are going through, and men have not necessarily had that amount of practice because they've been taught that to be a good man is to be an alpha man. It's to not be thinking all the time about other people but kind of be focused on the task. So yeah, to go back to empathy, I think this is so kind of like 2024 like online speak, but I do think that thinking of it in terms of centering versus decentering is a really easy way to kind of maybe visualize it. Maybe that's just me, so here what
Is
you
that
would
a
do.
is that a 2024 term, centering? I
I feel
haven't
like
heard that used.
honestly, oh, okay. So if you, that's funny. Obviously, the TikTok and Instagram algorithm is feeding us different things. So, what you were doing when you put on this, weight to try and, empathize with Alyssa is you were not just thinking about your experience, you were making sure to think about hers too. And in fact, you were making it almost impossible for you to not be doing that, which kind of goes against some of the gender training that you've probably gone through.
Mhm.
Whereas I don't know Alyssa, but presumably Alyssa would have gone through training where she's probably been trained to be quite attuned to you, and what you're going through. Although again, I'm these are all theories. But anyways,
Stereotypes are fine here. You can That's appropriate.
So yeah, so I think empathy in action, love in action, care in action, and very quickly on that, the reason I think it's really important to think of these things as not fixed. One, it tells you that you can acquire those skills, but two, I think that's part of what's been so nauseous about the conversations, for example, around emotional intelligence, which kind of thinks of emotional intelligence as just something that's happening at the top, among leaders, that we need more emotionally intelligent leaders. And actually, a lot of it takes out the time, effort, and skill that goes into actually doing emotional labor. When you think of a leader who has a lot of emotional intelligence, they are a leader who are doing a lot of emotional labor. But I think it's important to think of it as not just fixed, because it does take so much time. And in a traditional heteropatriarchal, family, if a woman is taking on far more emotional labor than her male partner, that means that there's going to be a huge penalty in terms of the time that she has to do other things, whether it's sleeping, whether it's leisure time, or anything that she might want to do. There are real consequences currently to the understanding the emotionality is just like what women do. It's just something we're better at, which we are, but only because we've been kind of trained and often forced into doing it. We don't have a choice. There is a real kind of penalty in terms of day-to-day life and, time management and enjoyment of really quality of life. Yeah.
I think I got my first comment the other day from one of my mental load videos saying, I know that Paige Connell and I know that like Laura Danger and probably you and all the women that talk about these things get tons of these comments. But I think this was the first time I got one which said mental load equals imaginary labor, which is just a guy trolling. And I'm curious, I made a video recently that I dollar quantified the value of some emotional labor that was being done by a certain person in a certain career field. Do you have a go-to story or example, like if you needed to like a hard anti maybe misogynist or something, and you're like, no, let me just give you a really concrete example of why emotional labor exists and why it's valuable.
I mean, a lot of the people who say this kind of thing look to the marketplace, to say like, well, if it's real labor, it's in the marketplace. Well, the truth is emotional labor is everywhere in the marketplace. It's the central component of so many jobs, millions of jobs. To be honest, it's the central component of millions of jobs that are far less replaceable than jobs that rely primarily on physical or intellectual labor. What I invite people to do when they say, oh, it's nonsense, is to invite them to think of what people in those kinds of professions, how they would be considered if they stopped doing emotional labor as a part of their job. So, if a server, didn't care about your experience in a restaurant or a bar and was like scowling at you when you came in, you would be pretty annoyed and you wouldn't leave them a tip. If a nurse is extremely disagreeable, with your family member as your family member's in hospital, as if that person, overwhelming it's she, withholds her emotional labor, you're going to be pretty annoyed. If a home health care aide, refuses to remember any of the details of your grandparents' life and is extremely abrasive with them when they come in and out of the house, you're going to think they're doing a really, really terrible job. If you call up customer care representative and they tell you that actually they don't really care about your problem because they're being their authentic selves, which so much is, when you're not doing emotional labor, you're just, blurting out whatever you feel like, you're going to think that customer care representative is doing a terrible job.
Yeah.
On top of that, what I would also say is increasing research across neuroscience and psychology really show that there is, huge ways in which as humans, we do not survive. It's not even about thriving. It's we do not survive without a deep sense of meaning, belonging, and care, and specifically connection to other human beings. There are all of these studies that are pretty grim that show that when a man loses his wife, suddenly becomes widowed, his lifespan, life expectancy falls drastically.
Mhm.
Whereas if a woman suddenly loses her husband, her life expectancy doesn't budge at all. And there's a lot of pointers that will,
That is so crazy. But
yeah,
like I get it.
yeah. So there's all sorts of ways in which effectively that care labor, that emotional labor that women in heteronormative patriarchal relationships are overwhelmingly providing to their husbands, like that is the difference between life and death. It's very grim,
Mhm.
but it's real. And there's this other longitudinal study that has been going on at Harvard for 80 years that tracks groups of men across different socioeconomic demographics, and really tracks, how well they're doing physically, mentally, how connected their relationships are. And the researchers at Harvard, having looked at really two groups of men, one from more lower socioeconomic brackets who did not go to Harvard, who lived in inner city Boston, and another group of men who went to Harvard and who therefore, in theory, going to have like really kind of plush, privileged lives. They found that the highest predictor of how healthy a man, or even whether he was alive, how healthy a man was going to be at 80 was how connected and positive his relationships were at 50. If you think of emotional labor as not just putting other people before yourself, but fundamentally the best part of emotional labor is the work of connection between human beings, is the work of building families, communities, entire societies, then, at micro levels and macro levels, there is just no way you can tell me it's not only not real, but it's also not valuable.
Hmm. Yeah, and I was really proud of the post that I made a couple weeks back. So it was the child life specialist, which I thought they were just nurses, but it wasn't until like I talked with one in a hospital. They're like, "Oh yeah, she's the child life specialist." Like, what's that person do? And I found out like they're responsible for our toddler was getting ear tubes, and her job is to bring in some toys, show them the surgery room, like walk her down the hallway, get comfortable with other people. And the anesthesiologist said, yeah, like without her, like we couldn't do our jobs. And I was like, holy crap. And at one point he was talking about they use goofy juice. Apparently it's like some version of a sedative for children, that they give them instead of just like I think she got laughing gas or something. I forget what it was, but um, I was like, that's interesting. So you're saying that if she doesn't do her job well, that they have to give them like some other medicine. How much does that medicine cost? So I did the math, and it looks like the average pay of a child life specialist is like $40,000 to $50,000. The low end, which is, I asked her like, what's the lowest? I said, hey, I'm going to make a video about this. I need some stats. What's the smallest amount of patients that you have? And then I like looked up what's the lowest cost of this medicine. Lowest was like 5 patients in a day, and assuming like 20% of them would have needed it in the first place, it was like $200 for a dose. And then we looked at the high end. So the low end of the value that they bring by not having to give the kids goofy juice, $60,000 a year. The high end is $2.5 million they saved the hospital every year just in the medication that they don't have to give the kids because they keep them sane.
That's amazing. It makes total sense too. I hope, please send me that video after we get off this call, because I'm
I
excited to
will.
check it out. It's
Someone
great.
told me also, it was really cool. Someone said, I don't, Zach, did you see this? And I guess the Child Life Specialists or Organization of America, like the day after, had like some post talking about the stats. And they're like, I don't think this is a coincidence.
But that's great. And I think that is going to be the future. And I think a lot of, I refer to automation. I do think that as, honestly, even being a doctor nowadays, if you can put it into a computer, soon doctors are not going to be quite as useful as we necessarily think they are right now.
Mm-hmm.
But that labor, that emotional labor of making sure that the patient is in the right frame of mind, not just to go through something disagreeable, but to heal. That's not something we can get a robot to do, certainly not effectively anyway.
Yeah, I came close to doing this study with Meta back in March or something, and they pretty much wanted to have me do my coaching via conversation with some people. They were going to study the way that I did it. I almost did it because they were going to give me like $4,000 for it, and then Alyssa was like, "That's a terrible idea. Like, why are you giving that away?" I was like, someone's gonna do it either way, so I might as well get it some dollars." I was talking with the guy, and he's like, is this going to be able to replace me? He's like, the hardest thing for AI to do, so pretty much training an AI to be able to talk like me or talk like a generic relationship coach, it has a really hard time reading the room, is what he said. So like the ability to notice the timing cadence of a conversation, notice that they shared something kind of vulnerable and then stopped being as vulnerable, and being able to say, hey, you shared something really vulnerable there. Like, can you say a little bit more about that? Because I know that was probably took courage for you. That's the part that AI has a really hard time with. So I double down on that, as like, even the meta researchers are saying that emotional labor is what AI struggles with the most right now.
Yeah. So honestly, hopefully, as people realize that more and more, hopefully we start to have as a society better conversations around emotional labor, because of course, this, but I think a lot of people who are kind of unfamiliar with the topic coming to this topic don't realize is, the solution with emotional labor is not to get rid of emotional labor. Emotional labor is just so deeply essential and valuable. It's to get rid of the extractive kind of distribution of emotional labor, where it's just one group or one set of groups doing it and another set of groups not only not doing it, but kind of largely oblivious to it.
There was another moment where I've been thinking about hiring a VA, and I took a discovery call with this company that trains people out of the Philippines, which I guess they are trained in English at a very young age. And I thought to myself, I really want a mom that really gets it. And then I was pausing. I was like, I think I'm more interested in a mom that understands the situation and will do the emotional labor that I need to land new clients, rather than someone that's probably really good at like doing delegative tasks. And I was like, I know I'm going to have to pay for it. And I think that was one of the huge takeaways, I think, from your book, was like, not only seeing the invisibility of it, but seeing the financial value, like the quantitative value, and like the not, we shouldn't be not asking for it. We should just be paying for it.
Right.
And like even pointing out like having like a legitimate minimum wage for, I was like ready to boycott like restaurants for a couple months after whatever that chapter was, where it was like pointing out that they're pretty much paid what $2 or $3 an hour and the rest is tips. Like, why not give them working wage and like have
Right.
them not have to pour it on?
And it goes back to, if you want to think about the dollar amount, you can also think about, a restaurant. Like, I have a favorite restaurant here in Detroit that I go to with my husband, Andrew. I mean, a sizable proportion of why we go is because we love the people who work there, and because we sit at the bar and we have lovely conversations. That's emotional labor. If we think of a lot of brands, the person who originally came up with the term emotional labor, Arlie Hochschild, who's an incredible sociologist at Berkeley, although she's retired now, she studied flight attendants in the early 80s. And at the time, flying was really glamorous. And she really came up with this term to describe a work that flight attendants were doing to provide shore care to customers, passengers, to provide a sense of sexiness and reassurance, sure. But also what she said is like, these flight attendants are building the brand of the company. They're building, in this day and age where we do think about brands a lot of how a brand is built is on the emotional labor of the people who work at that company.
Mm-hmm.
And the degree to which they're doing, if you think about Spirit Airlines versus, I don't know, American Airlines, you're probably going to think of it in part in terms of how you were treated, um, if you had different experiences with, with either of those companies by the people who work for those companies.
Yeah, and in April, I'm going to tear up just a tiny bit from this one. Is in April there was like in New England, it was like we're oh yay spring, and then all of a sudden we got hit with like one more blizzard right as I was about to go on my trip.
No.
Our flight got delayed for I think 2.5, 3 hours or something, and at one point like I didn't want to be one more guy asking the flight attendant questions, like logistical questions. So I was just trying to listen in so that I wasn't making her double her work. But at some point, when I was confused about something and she was walking out and we were all back in the terminal, um, I asked her a question. And then I saw her walking back like 45 minutes later as they're like, oh, we're going to board again if you want to stay on this plane. And someone else was like hysterical. This guy was like really upset. And I just saw her like, what was it from your book, being a man manager, right? Um, was what your mom said to you in chapter one. And, I ended up getting back on the flight and I was sitting near where she was stationed. I said, hey, just thank you so much for the emotional labor you did. And she was like beside herself. She didn't know what to say, being acknowledged for the work that she did. But like, it was really cool for me knowing that I could acknowledge her for something that she did. Probably, I'm not even sure she had the language for I think she got it, but like I don't even know if she'd ever heard those words before. She did like a double take.
Yeah, it's wonderful that you said that. And I think acknowledgement and thanks go a long way. Yes, we should in professional environments pay for emotional labor to reflect the value, not because we need to be charitable, but because we need to actually reflect the genuine value that workers are creating when they are doing that emotional labor. But pay is not the only way forward. Obviously, evening out who does emotional labor so that if you are in a non-professional relationship, it's not just one person carrying that load, but the other person too. That doesn't need to be transactional at all, as long as there's some kind of understanding of open-ended mutuality or reciprocity. It's not just going in one direction, it's also going in the other.
Yeah. If you were to leave the listeners here with maybe one final note, what would you say?
I mean, I don't know. I put years of my life into this. I've got. What would I say? I would say, emotional labor is real. If you want to find out more about it, you can read my book. But it is real. It has value. It should be visible. I think there is a tidal shift that's happening that's really exciting. And this is definitely a really important battle because it's a battle to point out that not just my experience, but my time is worth the same as your experience and your time. And it's not because I'm a woman and you're a man that mine is worth less, and I should therefore put my time and experience to work for yours. But that ultimately this battle is one that I think can be fought by everyone, not just women. And it's a battle where if we do win, the winners are not, it's not just like women winning over men. It's like there's a lot of fulfillment to be found in learning more about your emotional, inside, and putting it to work to connect with the people around you, that kind of open-ended reciprocity that creates those beautiful ties. That's what creates meaningful relationships that aren't extractive, that are durable, whether it's friendships, family, loved ones, etc.
Rose, thank you so much for coming on with me today. I think there's so many moments when I think to myself, oh, I'm just kind of shooting the shit with a friend, but I forget because you've trained me so well to understand emotional labor that like I forget that this is a foreign language to a lot of people. So thank you for making it not a foreign language to me. For those listening, I think Rose's book, it's a little gut wrenching in the history she goes into and the challenges that I think a lot of the people that you talked with go into. But really powerful book. I would say it's the second piece that really solidified my understanding after Fair Play. and hit on a different flavor of what I need to hear to be an invisible labor coach, if you will. So get her book, and I think you still make videos on Instagram and TikTok. Rose.Hackwoman. Just as I kind of loved that change in title that you came up with.
Thank you so much, Zach, and thank you so much for helping me spread the word on this really important issue.
You're welcome. All right. Thanks, Rose.
Thank you.